The flavor was off, slightly metallic. But the neighbors in Iron River, Michigan, didn't want to be rude. They chewed, swallowed, and complimented Kelly Cochran on her cooking, unaware they were digesting the remains of a missing Air Force veteran. It was 2014, and this wasn't an accident. It was the fulfillment of a murderous blood pact made on a wedding night years prior. As the sun set on that suburban backyard, the guests had no idea they were helping a serial killer destroy the evidence of her latest thrill. One man was dead, another was watching, and the nightmare was only beginning. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. The roots of this darkness didn't take hold in the cold soil of Michigan. They were planted years earlier in the industrial landscape of Merrillville, Indiana. Kelly Marie Moore and Jason Cochran were the quintessential high school sweethearts. At least, that was the image they projected to the world of the late 1990s. Kelly was a striking figure. Standing nearly 6 feet tall, she possessed a physical presence that was often described as imposing. She was intelligent, articulate, and possessed a magnetic, if somewhat unsettling, energy. Jason, by contrast, was smaller in stature and quieter in temperament, a man who seemed entirely defined by his devotion to the woman at his side. Their peers saw a couple that was inseparable, but the nature of that bond was far more restrictive than anyone could have guessed. They married in 2002, a union that was less about a romantic future and more about a dark, binding contract. It was on their wedding night that the couple reportedly entered into a pact that would eventually lead to the destruction of multiple lives. This wasn't a standard vow of, "until death do us part." It was a literal blood oath of mutual destruction. They agreed that if either of them ever strayed from the marriage, if an outsider ever threatened the integrity of their unit, that person would be eliminated. More chillingly, the spouse who committed the infidelity would be required to assist in the killing. It was a pact of blood designed to ensure that no one could ever come between them, a way to turn jealousy into a weapon of shared guilt. For over a decade, the Cochrans lived a relatively quiet, blue-collar life in Indiana. Kelly was the primary driver of the relationship, both socially and financially, while Jason's health began a slow, agonizing decline. A severe back injury from a work accident left him in chronic pain, eventually leading to a dependency on prescription opioids that clouded his judgment and heightened his insecurity. As Jason became more physically frail and reclusive, Kelly's dominance grew. She was the one who sought out excitement, the one who tested the boundaries of their social circles. Friends from their Indiana years later recalled that Kelly seemed to enjoy the power she held over Jason, often flirting with other men just to watch his reaction, to see the flash of territorial rage in his eyes that reminded her of their secret agreement. By 2013, the Cochrans decided they needed a fresh start. They packed their belongings and moved several hundred miles north to Iron River, a remote, rugged town in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. It was a place where the winters were long and the forests were dense, the perfect backdrop for a couple looking to leave their past behind. They settled into a modest house on Casper Street, a quiet neighborhood where the residents looked out for one another. To the people of Iron River, the Cochrans were just another pair of newcomers trying to make it in a tough economy. Kelly quickly landed a job as a production worker at Oldberg, a local manufacturing plant, while Jason stayed home, hampered by his failing back and his growing list of medications. In Iron River, the power dynamic shifted even further. Kelly was now the sole breadwinner, spending her days on the factory floor and her evenings at local bars, soaking in the attention of a new community. She was known for her quick wit, her ability to outdrink most men, and a certain rough-around-the-edges charm that made her popular among her coworkers. Jason, meanwhile, sat in their darkened living room, his world shrinking to the four walls of their home, and the gnawing fear that his vibrant, imposing wife was slipping away from him. He was a man living in the shadow of a woman who was increasingly hungry for a reason to trigger their wedding night pact. She didn't just want an affair, she wanted a sacrifice. The atmosphere in the Cochran household during that first year in Michigan was described by those who visited as heavy, a thick layer of unspoken tension that seemed to vibrate between the husband and wife. Kelly would often recount stories of men at the plant who had taken an interest in her, recounting the details to Jason with a clinical detachment that seemed designed to provoke him. She was looking for a catalyst, a person who was friendly enough to fall into her trap, but significant enough to make the blood pact feel earned. In the late summer of 2014, she finally found that catalyst in a man named Christopher Regan. He was everything Jason wasn't: healthy, independent, and full of life. And Kelly knew exactly how to use him to bring her husband's darkest promises to fruition. Christopher Regan was a man who appreciated the quiet reliability of a well-earned life, a 53-year-old Air Force veteran who had seen the world and decided that the rugged, pine-scented landscape of Michigan's Upper Peninsula was where he wanted to plant his roots. He was known among his peers as a man of discipline and warmth, someone who could fix a complex machine as easily as he could strike up a conversation with a stranger in a diner. After a recent divorce, he had moved to Iron River to take a job as a production manager at the Oldenburg manufacturing facility, a place that hummed with the heavy, rhythmic thrum of production for naval ship parts. For Chris, the job was a stable anchor, a way to bridge the gap between his military past and a peaceful retirement. He spent his free time hiking the trails of Iron County, capturing the stark beauty of the woods through his camera lens, not realizing that the most dangerous predator in those forests was already punching the same time clock as him. The factory floor at Oldenburg was a world of steel, grease, and the constant metallic tang of industrial work. It was in this environment that Chris first met Kelly Cochran. At 34, Kelly was nearly 20 years his junior, yet she possessed a commanding, almost aggressive presence that stood out among the other workers. She was vocal, physically imposing, and had a way of looking at people that felt less like an introduction and more like a tactical assessment. To Chris, she was a welcome spark of energy in the repetitive grind of the factory floor. They began as friendly coworkers, sharing coffee and conversation in the break room, but Kelly had a talent for accelerating intimacy, for making a man feel like the sole focus of her world. The affair began in the late summer of 2014, a season where the air in the Upper Peninsula begins to turn crisp and the leaves start their slow transition into shades of amber and rust. Kelly didn't just enter Chris's life, she occupied it. She painted a picture of herself as a woman trapped in a stagnant, unhappy marriage to a man who was physically and emotionally fading. She told Chris that Jason was aware of her extracurricular interests and that he simply didn't care, a lie designed to lower Chris's defenses and make the relationship feel safe. For a man like Chris, who valued honesty and directness, the idea of a mutually understood, open marriage was easier to digest than the reality of a jealous husband waiting in the shadows. Behind the closed doors of the Cochran house on Casper Street, the atmosphere was far more volatile than Kelly let on. Jason was a man in a state of slow collapse, hampered by chronic back pain, struggling with depression, and increasingly reliant on the medications that Kelly often controlled. He was a worrier by nature, a man who felt his grip on his vibrant wife slipping away with every hour she spent away from the home. Kelly didn't soothe his insecurities, she weaponized them. She would return home and recount her interactions with Chris, describing the veteran's kindness and vitality in a way that felt like a direct insult to Jason's own frailty. She was pushing her husband toward the edge, reminding him of the wedding night pact they had made years earlier, the promise that any outsider who threatened their bond would be eliminated. The psychological games Kelly played weren't limited to the two men at the center of the triangle. She was also reportedly engaging with another coworker, Eric Erickson, around the same time. It was as if she were gathering options for a sacrifice, scouting for the perfect candidate to test the strength of Jason's devotion and the lethality of their shared oath. Chris Regan, With his predictable routines and his genuine affection for Kelly was the easiest target to track. He was a man who followed his heart, even when it led him into the tangled web of a woman who viewed relationships as a form of combat. As the weeks progressed, Chris began to realize that the relationship with Kelly wasn't going to be the long-term partnership he had perhaps hoped for. He was a man of substance, looking for a genuine connection, while Kelly was increasingly erratic and demanding. He began to pull back, focusing more on his upcoming plans to move to Asheville, North Carolina, for a fresh job opportunity. He was gassing up his car, packing his apartment, and looking toward a future that didn't include the heavy, suffocating drama of the Cochran household. To Chris, the affair was a seasonal distraction that had run its course. But to Kelly, his desire to leave was a personal affront that could only be answered with the terms of the pact. She began to coordinate the final movement of the trap. She whispered to Jason that Chris was the one who was pushing the boundaries, that he was the threat they had discussed on their wedding night. She convinced her husband that the only way to save their marriage, to prove that they were still the unit they had sworn to be, was to follow through on their promise. Jason, desperate to reclaim his status and appease the woman he worshipped, agreed to the impossible. The plan was not just to kill, but to participate together, to bond their souls through a shared, horrific secret that would ensure neither could ever leave the other. In the days leading up to October 14th, 2014, Kelly maintained a mask of absolute normalcy. She continued to flirt with Chris, discussing his move, and even helping him with the logistics of his departure. She was the one who suggested a final lasagna and sex encounter at her home, a classic, manipulative goodbye that Chris had no reason to refuse. He saw it as a kind gesture, a final pleasant memory before he drove south, unaware that the instructions for the meal and the encounter were being discussed in the basement below. Inside the house, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of Jason's heavy tobacco and the underlying sterile smell of the medications he took to manage his pain. Jason himself was out of sight, tucked away in the shadows of the small home, waiting for the signal. Kelly led Chris toward the door, her voice light as she welcomed him for what he thought was their final night together. She moved with a practiced ease, her large frame blocking the light from the hallway, casting long, jagged shadows across the wooden floor. Chris followed, his mind likely on his journey the next morning, thinking about the boxes he still had to tape shut. He entered the Cochran residence on that Tuesday evening with the relaxed confidence of a man meeting a friend, not realizing that the basement floor was already being prepped for the aftermath of his arrival. The irony of Chris's life was that his military background, which had taught him to identify threats on a battlefield, had not prepared him for the domestic warfare of a sociopathic marriage. He stepped into the small, nondescript house, the smell of autumn wood smoke in the air, and moved toward the woman he believed was his lover. Unaware that her husband was already positioned with a rifle, waiting for the signal to honor a blood pact that had been waiting for a victim for 12 years. Tuesday, October 14th, 2014, began as a day of transition for Christopher Reagan, a man with his eyes fixed firmly on the horizon. His bags were largely packed, his vehicle was prepped for the long haul to North Carolina, and his departure from the rugged chill of Iron River was only hours away. He viewed his final visit to the Cochran residence as a graceful exit, a chance to share a final meal and say a quiet goodbye to a woman who had been a significant, if complicated, part of his recent past. He pulled his vehicle into the driveway on Casper Street as the autumn twilight began to deepen, the air turning sharp with the promise of an early frost. He stepped out of the car, likely feeling the weight of the move ahead of him, and walked toward the front door of the modest home, unaware that the interior had been meticulously staged for his arrival. Inside, the atmosphere was a calculated mask of domestic warmth. Kelly had prepared a lasagna, the very meal she had used as a lure, and the scent of garlic and baked pasta filled the small house, creating a sensory trap that signaled safety and intimacy. But beneath the aroma of the meal was the stale, sterile scent of the medications Jason used to numb his chronic pain. Jason himself was invisible, a ghost in his own home, tucked away in a pre-arranged position in the shadows. He was a man fueled by a toxic cocktail of physical agony, opioid-induced haze, and a desperate need to reclaim his standing in Kelly's eyes. He gripped a .22 caliber rifle, a weapon chosen for its relatively quiet report and its clinical efficiency at close range. The weapon was an extension of the blood pact they had sworn over a decade ago, a physical manifestation of a promise that was about to be kept. The ruse began shortly after the meal. Kelly initiated a practiced sequence of events designed to move Chris into the kill zone. She directed his attention toward a light fixture in the basement or a nearby workspace, claiming that it was malfunctioning and needed a veteran's eye to fix. It was a request that played perfectly into Chris's nature, a man who was always willing to help, always ready to apply his mechanical skills to a problem. As he turned his back to the room to inspect the fixture, he was no longer a lover or a friend. He was a target. The transition from life to evidence was instantaneous. From the shadows, Jason stepped forward with the rifle. There was no dramatic confrontation, no exchange of words, only the sharp metallic snap of the firing pin and the muffled pop of the .22 round. The bullet struck Chris in the back of the head, a cowardly and clinical execution that sent him to the floor before he could even register the betrayal. In that moment, the blood pact was no longer a theoretical oath. It was a shared reality. The silence that followed the shot was heavy, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the distant rhythmic ticking of a clock. What followed was a descent into a level of depravity that most people cannot comprehend. The Cochrans didn't panic. They went to work. They moved Chris's body to the basement, a space they had already prepared with plastic sheeting and the tools of their grisly trade. The primary instrument of their shared work was a reciprocating saw, a sawzall. Kelly would later describe the process to investigators with a chilling, detached precision, explaining how they worked together to process the man who had been her lover. The sound of the saw would have been a jagged, mechanical scream echoing through the floorboards of the quiet Casper Street neighborhood. The vibration would have been felt in their own hands as they moved the blade through bone and tissue, a rhythmic, industrial labor that lasted for hours. Kelly was reportedly the one who directed the process, showing no signs of the emotional or physical revulsion that would paralyze a normal person. She viewed the task as a logistical necessity, a way to honor the pact and ensure their mutual survival. They worked through the night, the basement light casting long, distorted shadows as they reduced a human being into a series of manageable packages. The remains were placed into heavy-duty plastic bags, which were then stored in a freezer in the garage. But the most horrific aspect of the cleanup wasn't just the disposal of the body. It was the psychological game Kelly played with the community. In the days following the murder, the Cochrans didn't retreat into isolation. Instead, they hosted a neighborhood barbecue. Neighbors later recalled a gathering where Kelly was the life of the party, laughing and serving meat that she claimed was special, something she had processed herself. Several guests noted that the meat had a strange, slightly metallic flavor that they couldn't quite place, but they ate it anyway, unwilling to offend their hosts. The realization of what they might have consumed would later haunt the residents of Iron River for years. To Kelly, serving Chris's remains to her neighbors wasn't just a way to dispose of evidence. It was an ultimate act of dominance and mockery. She was forcing the community to participate in her crime, turning a mundane social ritual into a cannibalistic secret that only she and Jason truly understood. The cleaning of the house was just as meticulous. They used gallons of bleach and industrial cleaners to scrub the basement floor, targeting every crevice and crack where biological evidence might linger. They burned Chris's clothing and personal effects in a backyard fire pit, the smoke drifting up into the Michigan sky, carrying away the last remnants of his identity. By the time the sun rose on the morning after the lasagna dinner, the Cochran house looked exactly as it always had, a quiet, nondescript home in a blue-collar town. The only difference was the contents of the freezer in the garage and the new, jagged bond between the husband and wife, a bond forged in the blood of a man who had made the mistake of believing in Kelly Cochran's humanity. The silence that followed the departure of Christopher Reagan from the world was not immediate. It was a slow, creeping realization that began with a missing presence at a morning meeting. On October 17th, 2014, Chris was expected to begin his new life in Asheville, North Carolina, a 1,000-mile journey from the iron-rich soil of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. When he failed to show up for his first day at the new job, the professional concern quickly curdled into a personal dread among his family and friends. Chris was a man of his word, an Air Force veteran whose life was governed by schedules and reliability. His absence was a loud, discordant note in the quiet rhythm of Iron River. The first physical evidence of his disappearance was found 10 days later, on October 27th. His vehicle, an Oldsmobile, was discovered in a park-and-ride lot off US 2, just outside of town. The car sat like a tomb, its windows frosted by the early Michigan winter, untouched and abandoned. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no broken glass. Just the heavy, oppressive weight of a man who had simply stepped out of his life and vanished into the tree line. The discovery turned a missing persons case into a criminal investigation, and the focus of the Iron River Police Department, led by Chief Laura Frizzo, turned toward the people who had seen him last. Chief Frizzo was a tenacious investigator, a woman who knew the terrain and the people of Iron County. When the name Kelly Cochran surfaced as a frequent contact in Chris's phone records, the detectives made their way to the house on Casper Street. The first meeting with Kelly was a study in unsettling behavior. Rather than the expected somberness of a woman whose friend had disappeared, Kelly was light, engaging, and strangely flirtatious. She told the investigators that she and Chris had been involved in a casual affair, one that her husband, Jason, was not only aware of, but supposedly encouraged. She leaned against the doorframe, her large frame casting a shadow over the porch, and spoke about Chris with a detached fondness that felt rehearsed. Jason's presence during these early interviews was even more jarring. He sat in the background, a frail, nervous figure who seemed to be constantly checking with Kelly before he spoke. When he did offer information, his voice was thin and strained. He told the detectives that he had no ill will toward Chris and that he only wanted to see the man found safely, but his eyes told a different story. They were darting, restless, and filled with a visible terror that the investigators couldn't quite place. He seemed like a man who was vibrating with a secret he wasn't strong enough to hold, yet he remained tethered to his wife's side like a frightened child. The community of Iron River was soon swept up in the search efforts. Volunteers combed the dense forests and the jagged banks of the Iron River, their breath visible in the freezing air. They looked for disturbed earth, for discarded clothing, for anything that might lead them to the veteran. Meanwhile, Kelly Cochran was doing something entirely different. She began a strange psychological game with Chief Frizzo, calling the police station frequently and showing up unannounced to check on the progress of the case. She tried to insert herself into the investigation, acting as if she and the chief were peers, two strong women navigating a man's world. It was a classic hider-in-plain-sight tactic, the arrogance of a killer who believes they are smarter than the law. Behind the scenes, the Cochrans were liquidating their lives. Shortly after the car was found, they put their house on the market and began making plans to move back to Indiana. They told their neighbors that the drama of the investigation was too much for Jason's health to handle. To the police, this looked like a tactical retreat. A search warrant was eventually executed on the Casper Street home, but the results were frustratingly thin. The basement had been scrubbed with a level of intensity that bordered on the clinical. The floorboards were spotless, and the scent of bleach was so strong it made the officers' eyes water. They found small traces of what they suspected was blood, but without a body or a confession, the evidence was circumstantial at best. The frustration in the police department was palpable. They knew the Cochrans were involved, but Kelly's mask remained perfectly intact. She continued to play the role of the misunderstood woman, even as rumors began to swirl through the town about that neighborhood barbecue. People started talking about the sweet-tasting meat, and Kelly's odd comments about processing things herself. The gossip was a dark, persistent hum underneath the official investigation, creating an atmosphere of suspicion that made Iron River feel smaller and more claustrophobic with each passing day. As the weeks turned into months, the search for Chris Reagan stalled. The winter snows buried the landscape, hiding any potential evidence under feet of white silence. Chris's family was left in a state of agonizing limbo, caught between the hope of his return and the growing certainty that he had met a violent end. Kelly and Jason eventually left Michigan, slipping away to Merrillville, Indiana, believing they had outrun the shadow of the Casper Street basement. They thought the blood pact had protected them, that by sharing the weight of the saw and the bleach, they had become untouchable. But Chief Frizzo wasn't letting go. She kept the case file on her desk, a constant reminder of the veteran who hadn't made it to North Carolina. She continued to monitor the Cochrans from a distance, waiting for the inevitable crack in the foundation of their toxic union. She knew that a bond built on blood and sawzalls couldn't last forever, and that eventually the weight of the secret would become too heavy even for a woman like Kelly to carry. The search wasn't over. It had simply moved from the woods of Michigan to the psychological battlefield of Indiana, where the next victim of the wedding night pact was already living on borrowed time. The investigation into the disappearance of Christopher Regan didn't die when the snow fell over Iron River. It simply went underground, following the Cochrans as they retreated back to the industrial familiarity of Merrillville, Indiana. For over a year, a strange, silent stalemate existed between the Michigan authorities and the couple. Chief Laura Frizzo remained convinced that the answer to Chris's fate lay within the heavy, bleach-scented basement of the house on Casper Street. But without a body or a witness, the law was paralyzed. That changed on February 20th, 2016, when a frantic 911 call originated from the Cochrans' new residence. Jason Cochran was dead. To the responding officers in Indiana, it looked like a tragic, if somewhat expected, conclusion to a life lived in the grip of chronic pain. Jason was found unresponsive, and Kelly, playing the role of the devastated widow to perfection, claimed that her husband had finally succumbed to his health struggles and a potential overdose of his prescribed medications. Initially, the scene was processed as a medical emergency, followed by a natural death. But the timing was too convenient for the investigators in Michigan. Jason was the weak link in the blood pact, the man whose eyes darted with terror every time a badge appeared on his porch. With him gone, the only other person who knew what happened in that Michigan basement was Kelly. The pivot in the case came when the Lake County Medical Examiner's Office conducted the autopsy. While Jason did have a high level of heroin in his system, the forensic pathologist discovered something that shattered Kelly's accidental overdose narrative. There were subtle but undeniable signs of asphyxiation, petechial hemorrhages in the eyes, and bruising that suggested someone had forcibly held a pillow or a hand over Jason's face until his heart stopped. The heroin hadn't killed him. It had merely neutralized him, making him a passive participant in his own murder. Kelly hadn't just lost a husband, she had liquidated an asset that had become a liability. As the Indiana authorities moved to classify the death as a homicide, Kelly sensed the shift in the atmosphere. She didn't wait for the handcuffs. She packed a bag and fled, launching a multi-state manhunt that eventually ended in Kentucky. When the United States Marshals finally closed in, Kelly didn't go down fighting. She surrendered with a chilling calm, almost as if she had been waiting for the curtain to rise on the final act of her performance. She was extradited back to the Midwest, and the interrogation that followed would become a landmark in the study of the sociopathic mind. The interrogation room was a stark contrast to the domestic stages Kelly was used to. Under the hum of the fluorescent lights, the mask of sanity began to slip, not because Kelly was breaking, but because she was bored. She began a series of high-stakes interviews with investigators, including a particularly intense session with Detective Jeremy Ogden. Kelly didn't just confess, she negotiated. She spoke about the night of October 14th, 2014, with the clinical detachment of a surgeon describing a routine procedure. She admitted to the killing of Christopher Reagan, but in her version of the story, she was a victim of Jason's jealousy. She claimed that Jason had caught them together and forced her to watch the execution, then compelled her to help dismember the body to ensure her silence. It was during these sessions that the full, nauseating scope of the blood pact was revealed. Kelly described the wedding night oath in detail, the agreement that any interloper would be sacrificed. But as the detectives pushed further, the most horrific detail of the Iron River investigation resurfaced: the neighborhood barbecue. Kelly admitted that she had processed Chris's remains and served them to the unsuspecting residents of Casper Street. She spoke about the sweetness of the meat and the irony of her neighbors praising her cooking while they consumed the man they had seen walking his dog just days before. It was an admission that sent a shockwave through the Iron River community, turning a local tragedy into a permanent psychological scar for everyone who had attended that gathering. The investigation then turned to the physical recovery of the evidence Kelly had described. In a scene that felt ripped from a gothic horror novel, Kelly led investigators into the dense, mosquito-ridden woods of the Upper Peninsula. She walked through the brush with an uncanny sense of direction, eventually pointing to a specific patch of earth near a cluster of pines. There, beneath the layers of pine needles and dirt, forensics teams discovered the upper portion of a human skull. It bore a single, clean entry wound from a .22 caliber round. Christopher Reagan had finally been found. The psychological profile that emerged during the investigation was that of a woman who viewed other people as objects to be manipulated or consumed, quite literally. Kelly admitted that she had killed Jason not out of fear, but as a form of evening the score. She felt that by killing Chris, Jason had taken away something she valued, and therefore his life was the only acceptable currency to balance the books. She had injected him with a lethal dose of heroin and then sat on his chest, covering his face while he struggled weakly beneath her, watching the life leave his eyes with the same curiosity she might have shown toward a broken machine. The investigation also touched on Kelly's claim that she was responsible for several other murders across multiple states, a claim of being a prolific serial killer. While many of these leads were difficult to verify due to her habit of weaving truth with elaborate lies, the sheer coldness of her demeanor made it impossible for the FBI to ignore. The detectives realized they weren't dealing with a woman who had been pushed too far by a toxic marriage. They were dealing with a predator who had found a partner willing to facilitate her darkest impulses and who had eventually outgrown him. By the time the case headed to trial, the investigation had painted a portrait of a marriage that wasn't a partnership. It was a joint venture in homicide, and Kelly Cochran was the CEO. The legal reckoning for Kelly Cochran began in an Iron County courtroom in early 2017. Prosecutors laid out a narrative of a wedding night pact that had transitioned from a dark fantasy into a mechanical reality, painting Kelly as the true architect of the violence. The jury didn't take long to see past her shifting stories and claims of victimhood. In May 2017, she was found guilty of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and several other charges related to the death of Chris Reagan. The judge didn't hold back, sentencing her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But the justice system wasn't finished. A year later, in an Indiana court, Kelly pleaded guilty to the murder of her husband, Jason. She admitted to the overdose and smothering method with a terrifying lack of emotion, receiving an additional 65-year sentence. As she was led away in shackles, her only concern seemed to be the spotlight, leaving behind 2 grieving families and a neighborhood forever haunted by a meal they can never forget. Today, the house on Casper Street stands as a silent, crumbling monument to a betrayal that defies human logic. Kelly Cochran remains behind bars, periodically teasing investigators with cryptic hints of 7 other victims buried across the Midwest, a cruel claim that keeps the families of the missing in a state of perpetual unrest. She is a woman who chose a dark blood pact over her own humanity, proving that some wedding vows are better left unmade. The former neighbors in Iron River still look at their backyard grills with a cold shudder, forever remembering the smiling woman who turned a quiet community into her unwitting accomplices. Christopher Reagan is finally home, but the darkness Kelly invited into that Michigan basement remains. Cold, hungry, and entirely unrepentant. Her story serves as a jagged reminder that the most terrifying predators aren't found in the woods, but in the people we choose to trust. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon.